I'm Tom Osland. I'm the moderator, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce the principles of Spurlock Poirier. Andy?
Oh, okay.
Andy Spurlock, Marty Poirier, and Lee Kyle. Before we get started, I just wanted to ask you all a question because I was doing some research on you, and you describe your work as being at the intersection of emotion and intellect. What does this mean to each one of you?
Oh, maybe I'll take that. One of the things going back almost from the inception of the firm was a conversation Andy and I were having about how, as we all know in life, things aren't one thing or another, and they're often two things simultaneously, that it can often be a paradox. So actually, intellect and emotion are just one of those word pairs that we've struck on that capture that it can't all be about the left brain or the right brain. It's got to be both. And we play with a lot of word pairings like that. So that's where that's coming from.
Okay.
Then I think later on in our practice, we had the opportunity to work with Robert Irwin, and he had taken on that specific issue in his work, and it in effect had a very dramatic effect on the way I thought about the work that I was doing and the work that we were doing. He had said that he's always dealing with a certain amount of fact and evidence and then a certain amount of intuition in his work. And he tries to keep them somewhat separate to a degree and then put them together. So that is what we do with a lot of these paradoxes that Marty referred to.
And I guess my other thought on that is that emotion or intuition is probably what motivated all of us maybe to become landscape architects at the beginning. It's that sort of emotional connection to your place, a place. And taking that as sort of the driving force behind our practice, and then applying, some kind of rigorous design and problem solving.
Great, thank you. Andy, you grew up in north central Ohio. What was that like?
Well, I grew up in a small town. My dad was a lawyer, and I was an artistic kid. I was not, I would say, didn't feel totally comfortable in the Midwest, like a lot of the other kids around me, and part of that was the fact that I'm gay. So it was, always felt a little bit as a fish out of water, and really wanted to look around at the rest of the world. So that is part of what I'm doing as a landscape architect, is exploring the rest of the world.
Right, your grandfather was an influence, you told me. How was that?
That's right. My grandfather was a penny store manager, but he was a very accomplished weekend painter. He would go on vacation to Florida and go to the Burnham School of Art, or the Ringling School of Art, and he would draw nudes, and he would do landscape paintings and figurative painting, and he was really talented. So I identified with him as a kid and started drawing when I was really young.
Right. I'm going to check something. We're having a little trouble with the slides. Can you check this thing? And it's not working. So while he's doing that, Andy, you attended Case Western, and your undergraduate degree was what?
My undergraduate degree was urban and environmental studies, but most of the time I was there, I was an English major. Mm-hmm. And I shifted into that program right at the end of my last year, because I was thinking, boy, I don't want to be an English teacher. I don't want to teach literature. And I had been exposed to, I really had a hard time deciding what I was really interested in, because I had wide-ranging interests. So I took classes at Cleveland Institute of Art as well as Case Western Reserve University. And Case and Western Reserve put together an interdisciplinary program called Urban and Environmental Studies. And I was in the first class. And it was really terrific because I could study anything I wanted.
That's great. What did Cleveland offer you when you were there?
Well, I've got, I might talk about this one first.
Okay.
This is John, my husband, on the left, who has a lot to do with why I'm in San Diego. Although I met him after we moved to San Diego, or after I moved to San Diego. And on the right is a watercolor painting I did as a kid when I was in an art class. I would take art classes in the summer where other kids might be playing baseball. And then you could go on to the next slide. The time that I was in Cleveland was the time of total ferment in this country. And it was the time of the Glenville riots, the Huff riots. They were right adjacent to Western Reserve University where I was going to school. But the setting for Western Reserve is a bucolic masterpiece designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. So you had this extreme paradox of beautiful urban setting for the art museum and the urban decay of Huff and Glenville and the riots and the Vietnam War. So it has a lot to do with the curiosity and my interest in exploring lots of different facets in the profession. I was an English major, but I kept getting pulled away into other avenues of study and just never really focused on anything, which is a great thing for landscape architecture.
So this is where this paradoxical thinking started.
Yeah, I was interested in the social unrest and was particularly inspired by Harold Mayer, who was an urban geographer, who talked a lot about why cities were exploding at that time from a geographic and social point of view, and I found it really interesting. And later tied it to my interest in art and design.
Right. So you told me that there were two books that were very influential.
I did?
You did.
I'll find out
One
what they
was
were.
The Map That Changed the World,
Okay.
and Kevin Lynch's Image of the City. Tell us about that.
Well, Lynch's Image of the City was one of the books that we read in urban geography. And that was in 1969. And I thought the thing that stuck with me about it was the way that Lynch was cognitively mapping places. And it related to my interest in painting and what I was studying in Victorian literature, which had been my major, about the relationship between painting and literature in the 19th century and landscape design. And somehow things were starting to really gel, that landscape is a character, that it has its own narrative, that it's extremely rich in terms of content.
You attended the University of Michigan to get a master's degree. Bill Johnson was your advisor.
That's right.
And, I can't help but draw these parallels between you two that are, scarily connected without actually sort of realizing that you were before you actually met. What was the focus of the program then?
Well, I didn't know who Bill Johnson was or that he was connected to the program or anything about him when I went to Michigan. I basically went there because I didn't like, I applied to 3 schools while I was in the Navy and had never been to any of them, University of Michigan, Harvard, and Penn. I went to the first 2 and didn't like either one of them because they were too focused at that time in the early 70s. Steinitz at Harvard and McCarg. I just sat down, had a meeting with McCarg and just didn't get along. So Michigan seemed more open-ended, but I really gravitated to Bill Johnson when I got there because he draws, and I can draw well. As I got started in the program, I was one of the few people who could draw well, because it was a program that brought in people from absolutely every discipline. And that was one of the things I also liked about it. Linguists, art historians, so forth. And Bill and I related in that way that we think about how we think about communicating visually.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So you graduated and you headed west. What was the draw?
Well, I came to California strictly because I couldn't get a job on the East Coast. I had really tried to go to the East Coast, looked in Boston, looked in New York, and looked in Canada. There's a lot of connection between the University of Michigan and Toronto, and I was attracted to go to a city, small town, wanted to go to a real city now, been in Cleveland, and just could not get a job. Talked to 200 different firms in 1975.
There were that many?
Oh, yes.
Wow.
You had to cover a lot of geography to talk to 200, which I did. I went across the country. And San Diego is one of the places where I got a job offer, and it happened to be from a firm that had a park master plan, and I had been teaching as a grad assistant in recreation planning. So he says, I should hire you. And it was to do the master plan for Florida Canyon and Balboa Park, which was a really terrific project and got me started in the field, kind of thinking about the large scale of planning. And it was directly related to what I was doing in school, but I was shocked to find that very little work of that type existed in California at that time. That most of the work was development planning, which I had not been exposed to at all.
So this was 1980?
No, this was 1975.
75, okay. So,
but I met John that year, so I had to stay
there
in
you go.
San Diego.
Yeah, it's a good reason.
Yeah.
So you worked at some great offices. You worked at SWA.
I did.
You worked at Pod, where you two guys met way
That's
back
right.
when. And after that, you started Land Studio.
That's right.
And I want you to, I know there was a movement that was going on in California and across the country at that time in landscape architecture, and you were involved in a show called The 6 Views of Landscape Architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that.
Well, I think at the time that I was, I'll back up a little bit and say that I went to SWA from San Diego, which I went to the Orange County office because I was not interested in doing model home design or residential landscape architecture, a lot of which was slope and erosion control planting. And SWA was trying to get their Orange County office started again after the recession in the 70s. So I got a call from a classmate, went to Orange County, worked on really interesting projects there at both large and small scale. And it was kind of urban and then larger scale planning, both site design, plaza design, and then larger scale 20,000 acre planning. But and then worked at Pod, which was a terrific experience as well, and very much influenced by Joe Yee. So then I wanted to move back to San Diego, mainly for personal reasons, because I was very happy at Pod, but to hook up with John again, and teamed with Ron Wigginton, who was an artist, landscape architect. He had a degree in art and in landscape architecture. And I was interested in the dialogue between the two ways of thinking. And we tried to straddle the boundaries between art and landscape. And it was really, in a sense, very confusing for me to do that, to think of a client both as a client in a sense of creating art or exploring our own kind of agenda and solving a problem for a client. And Ron and I did a pretty good job of getting through that. And part of that was being exhibited about deciding what it is we were trying to do and what ideas we were exploring. So we were intentionally doing installations and exhibits, and 6 Views was one of those.
Right.
And we were in the company of other landscape architects who were exploring ideas.
At the same time.
At the same time.
So Michael Van Valkenburg.
And Pamela Burton, see who else was in that. Mainly Southern California. It was at Cal State Fullerton.
George Hargraves.
George Hargraves.
And Peter Walker and
Yeah.
Martha Schwartz.
It's great. It's fascinating. So we're going to move on to Marty,
All right.
if that's okay. So Marty, born in Detroit
Yes?
to an ex-con.
Yeah.
Tell me what that's all about.
Oh, okay. This is psychoanalysis. I thought I was not at my psychiatrist's office.
You are.
All right. Okay. Let's see. Born in 1953 in Detroit, and it was an amazing time to be in the Motor City. And this is through my whole upbringing. You would just, if any time you went to the business section of the paper, the top 3 companies in the world were General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, and it was Detroit was just, and then Motown was alive, and that's where my father was born. My father was in the Navy, and the story of his, I won't dwell on it too much, but it was in high school he was known as Buick Poirier, and that's because that's the car he liked to steal with his friends and go joyriding.
And my Buick was stolen about that time.
Okay. I think he was a little older than you, Andy.
There you go.
And so he's in the Navy, and he's on leave in Detroit with all of his buddies that he used to steal cars with. And they steal a car to drive to Chicago, where they're based, and he's based in Corpus Christi, Texas. And as he said, like an idiot, he's not thinking. He drops them off, and they say, "Get on a train," and he goes, "No, I'll keep driving." So imagine a Chrysler New Yorker driving in Oklahoma during the war when gas is rationed, and the police pulled him over and asked for his driver's license and registration. He says, I don't have any, I stole the car. My dad spent, I didn't know this until I was 22 years old. My dad sat what you're seeing on the screen are my 3 younger sisters. Women in my life have been a major influence. My mother's 3 sisters, and our families were always together. My dad sits my mom and my 3 sisters down at Christmas time one year and says, "I've got a story to tell you." And what's that? Because my dad at this time is a successful executive at Chrysler Corporation, and he's the most ramrod straight guy. I mean, he was ultra disciplinarian. There was the right way and the wrong way, and seemed like everything I did was the wrong way. And so when he starts
we're not going to get into that.
When he starts telling me telling us that he was served a year in the federal penitentiary, it was quite a shock, but it also was one of those, I think, the first moment when I really started to understand that art imitates life. That, I thought we were just the perfect family and everything was just wonderful middle-class America. But that was a story, and I really started to begin to understand my father better. And what you see here in the picture too is how my father, in his own way, taught me about the landscape. He would take my sisters and I to Edward Hines Park. This is part of the Huron-Clinton park system in Detroit, and all these are sculpted man-made places, and of course I didn't know that as a kid, but my dad would take us to give my mom a break through all the different seasons, and this was the time of year that my father loved the most, and this was the hill we would also go sledding on in the winter. And I tell you, to this day, the more I thought about why I'm a landscape architect, it's because I just love playing in the woods. And I started to realize then much
great.
later in life that people make this stuff,
Yeah.
and then you can do it. And
That's awesome. That's great.
so that's
So your dad was a design engineer, so you were around design all your life.
yeah.
And you have a passion, like Andy has a passion for drawing. And you went on to Michigan State as an undergraduate, and not directly into landscape architecture, but you found it
Yeah.
somehow. And how was that? How'd that all come about?
Well, first, what you see on the screen is very emotional for me. This is part of my dad's huge portfolio from the Chrysler Engineering Institute, and a lot of it is maybe almost even the detail you can't appreciate. This is hand drawing of a probably a 19-year-old. He had gotten out of prison, and the guy who's his accomplice's father felt very guilty that his son didn't get caught, and his father had a connection to the guy who ran the Chrysler Engineering Institute, knew my father was an exceptional draftsman, and put in a good word for my dad. And so it's just outrageous. 1948, he's doing this work all by hand, all just exceptional, and it's what really inspired me to draw. I would also paint and play around with drafting. This is, of course, back when the public school system taught drafting in the 7th grade. So I followed in that footstep, but then my dad said, you absolutely do not want to go into anything related to engineering or design or art, because I've just hit a glass ceiling at Chrysler because don't have a business degree. So he says, you go to college and you start in business. And okay, sure. At that point, I was rather clueless about what I wanted to do. I was the first one in our huge family to ever go to college, and all I knew was that college was where you would rigorously apply yourself and learn more. And so as I'm walking to classes, I start paying extra attention to a building called the School of Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning. So I've been typically going into classrooms with the chalkboard and that kind of thing, and I walk into this building and there are drawings all over the wall, and there are drawings that I know I could do. And I talked to Dean Glick, who is the chair of the department, and I said, can you teach this? And he was, of course. And so that transformed my trajectory, and what a passion it began.
That's great. So you graduated. These are some of your dad's designs, right?
Yeah, this is some of the hundreds, if not thousands, of tail lights. My father did exterior lighting for Chrysler, and of course this is the go-go muscle car era, and these are just a handful of the just beautiful shapes that I paid attention to as a kid.
That's
my
great.
dad did.
So you graduated, you went to Johnson and Roy,
Yeah.
and you were apprenticed by Carl Johnson, and this kind of connection is just like too bizarre, right? I mean, you're two transplanted Midwesterners in San Diego with damn near the same lineage, right?
Yeah, we actually met in Orange County.
Yeah, I know, but you kind of it's interesting how
Los
that all
Angeles,
happened. So
That's true, Los Angeles.
Yeah.
in 1980, you left for California,
Yeah.
and you went to work for Pod.
Right.
And what was that like for you,
Well,
coming out of Detroit, going to L.A.?
Sure. The one thing about going to college started to teach me was living in community and being somewhere in a walkable place where everything in your daily life was there, and you could walk and you didn't need a car, because this is a big, Motor City. You use a car to go get your mail at the end of the driveway, So living in community was the thing that really started to make sense for me. And I worked in downtown Detroit, actually for Smith Henchman and Grills, which is the architecture firm that owned JJ&R at the time. And that was my play, because like Andy, I was I was starting my career in the oil embargo recession. There were no jobs, and I took a job in exterior signage and graphics to make my way eventually to JJ&R. But at JJ&R, there was the heritage of a couple guys, Fred Arbuckle and Todd Bennett, who'd been, Todd came out of the GSD and had gone to Johnson & Roy to focus on urban design, and he did some very significant projects, the urban design manual for downtown Detroit, and so it got me very interested in urban design, and I was at that point, having lived in Michigan all my life to that point, very curious about just living somewhere else, taking this big step to just move and leave my family and go out on my own. And growing up with television, I was very familiar with Los Angeles. I mean, just about every. So I was really, in a way, drawn to just the myth and lore of Los Angeles. Moved to Los Angeles, worked in the pod office there, and this image is because I love cars, love to drive, but I've never commuted. I've lived in cities, and so this is San Diego, the San Diego that I really don't care much about.
So in 1984, you left to come back east to attend the GSD.
Yeah, this time in the 1980, 81 is when Andy is also there at Pod, and we have a huge job in downtown Los Angeles that the firm won, Bunker Hill competition, and Andy and I started working together and became had a great strong rapport. Joe Yee, who Andy mentioned, was the principal in charge of the project. Joe was the most remarkable mentor in that he would really let you design, and it was something that Andy and I both were the beneficiary of, in that Joe would outline the problem, he would help us with any problem we had or intuitions and guidance, but we would work on it together, and Andy and I started doing this stuff together and having a great time, and that began.
I want to make an aside just about how this starts to conflate some more.
Please.
Which is that I had been working on the competition for Bunker Hill, the Cadillac Fairview project at SWA before I shifted over to Pod.
You
And
brought
had been
all the
working
trade
with
secrets.
Pete Walker on that project. So I had known Martha Schwartz from school. She went to University of Michigan, met Pete through SWA before he left SWA, and then went to Pod and worked with Marty.
Yeah.
And Marty has since gotten to know Pete, and
Yes.
it's all a little whirlwind.
Yeah, it was
It's a tight circle.
But what was really on my mind at the time was that I had gotten this absolutely rigorous, disciplined education in landscape architecture at Michigan State, but it was not the broadest design thinking education. At least I didn't pay attention to that part. And what I started to see working with the folks at Pod and JJ&R were that the people that I was gravitating toward appreciating their process and methodology were people that had gone to graduate school. And in Andy's case, there were also people that had a liberal arts education combined with design landscape architecture degree, and it really wore on me that I needed to learn more, and I paid attention to all the schools, and this was a very ripe time when at Harvard, where I elected to go, you had Laurie Olin as chair, Michael Van Valkenburg was just starting his time, but Pete Walker was teaching, as well as Carl Steinitz, and these were just leaders of thought in landscape architecture. So that was where I went, and it was where I met. Full disclosure, Tom and I have been friends ever since. Tom was in my class at the GSD, and that just opened a whole new realm of thinking for me as to how to work as a landscape architect.
Indeed. So what is the Wiedemann Prize?
Oh, that was a complete surprise. On graduation day, Harvard hands out 2 traveling fellowship awards, and the Jacob Wiedemann Prize was announced, and they said, and the winner is Martin Poirier. And I've never won anything in my life. Last picked on any
I don't
baseball
think Laura
team.
would agree with that.
Yeah. Well, later. So that's the prize is a stipend for a traveling fellowship, and it complicated things because I had at that point earned a generous offer from Pete and Martha to come work with them, and so then I had a hole burning in my pocket with this check to go traveling, and at this time I had met my wonderful wife Laura Burnett at the GSD, fellow classmate. We both worked in New York. Working with Pete and Martha there, and that was the time when we saved up enough money so we could both go traveling. So I had to say goodbye to Pete and Martha, and we went traveling for a year in Southeast Asia. And running through my head all this time is my friend Andy Spurlock back in San Diego, and I'm paying attention to that land studio is kind of imploding, and Andy maybe wants to just get out on his own. And I check back in with him when we come to San Diego, and he's just starting the Spurlock office, and he's Andy and another great employee, Leslie Ryan, and a receptionist. And I said, so how's it going? He says, well, we're just opening the office next week, and we could probably use some help. And so Laura and I thought we were helping Andy in the summer of 1988, and here 27 years later, it's just been this remarkable relationship of...
It was destiny. I mean, when you look at the facts, it was fate. Definitely. Lee, a New Yorker, dealing with these crazy Midwestern transplants, and you grew up just outside of the city, in the Hudson River Valley.
Yes, I did.
And it was influential.
It was a very, very cool landscape. I grew up just north of New York in Hastings-on-Hudson, it's a kind of a skinny little town right on the Hudson, really huge granite outcrops in everybody's backyard. And so, like I would guess most people in the room, I grew up mostly outdoors. Just, it had a really kind of strong imprint on me, I'd say. Just really got deeply familiar with cracks and crevices in my backyard and in the local woods.
And you two had a grandparent you were very close to.
I did. I actually had a whole group. I had my grandmother and her sisters were from Rhode Island and had lived there for generations. And both she and her sister were very sort of passionate naturalists and birders, and they saved their money and traveled around the world to go birding. And they also returned to Rhode Island and were very serious about open space preservation. Open space preservation and sort of native plant conservation early on, like in the 60s. So they relayed a lot of that to me, and I felt that same connection to Rhode Island and that place that I also felt to where I grew up.
So you got a BA in religion.
I did.
And so what did you do with that?
I went into the film business. What else would you do?
Perfect. They need some kind of conscience,
yeah,
right?
They do. So I had a real sort of classic liberal arts education, and I wound up a religion major for a variety of reasons, but sort of comparative religion. And I minored in art history, and what I was really interested in was filmmaking, film editing, sort of documentary filmmaking. And this was back in the late 70s, when there really weren't terribly many film programs, and none of them on the East Coast. So it was kind of easy to, not easy, but it was not impossible to break in to the film business. So when I graduated from college, I moved to New York City and just, knocked on doors and told everybody I knew that this is what I wanted to do. And I wound up, my first job in the film business was working in the art department actually an after-school special. I don't know if anybody here is old enough to remember after-school specials, but I was a production assistant to the art department, and it ended up being just a kind of ridiculously perfect fit for me, because the other thing I did when I was young, growing up, I was very passionate about making things, which is also probably true of most of the people here. But the thing that I really did every day for years was make houses out of cardboard, and I would try and recreate the stuff that I saw on TV. I did the Brady Bunch house. I did the chalet from the Pink Panther. I did, just whatever was sort of capturing my imagination. And I can remember trying to figure out how to make, sliding patio doors like the Brady Bunch had, and all of this just out of, scrap cardboard and bits of plastic and stuff like that.
So when Lee came to interview, we said, "Oh man, this is perfect."
So the film business was the art department in the film business was a really kind of remarkable fit. And I did that for about 10 years. And I was based out of New York. And what I worked on, just kind of the crew that I moved around and worked with, we did a lot of movies that shot all over the East Coast, based in New York, but we would work elsewhere. And they were mostly period films that ranged from like the 16th century to, we converted Red Hook, Brooklyn to its 1950s sort of shipping. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Shipping
That's
self.
yeah.
That's good.
So you attended career discovery at the GSD,
I did.
and you were there to take the passion of making the Brady Bunch house into architecture.
Yep.
But you saw a lecture there, and you were struck.
I saw A.E. Bai, and I was really struck. Oh yeah, this is one of my film sets. That's from, that was a movie called Matewan about the coal mining strikes of the 1920s. So we moved to West Virginia for like 6 months and shot on location and converted existing buildings. It was a great kind of immersion in kind of vernacular architecture and sort of the details of how people really live. But anyway, 10 years in the film business, I thought I wanted to do something that was more permanent, not so ephemeral. I wanted to have a little more kind of control over what got captured, You dress a set 360 degrees, but you just see a little piece of it, and the decision of what you see is made by the director of photography. So I felt really strongly that I wanted to be doing something that was more lasting, and I thought that was architecture. So I went to the GSD in architecture for 6 weeks, the career discovery program. It was just like kind of a brilliant way for me to make a turn. And I heard A.E. Bai. They do a little exit interview just to see if you're really going to sort of go forward with this. And the guy who was my sort of instructor for those 6 weeks said, "Are you sure you're not going into landscape architecture?" And I was like, "No, absolutely not. Architecture's for me." So I wound up going to Columbia. I was married at that time, by then, and my husband and I lived in New York and had for 10 years and really had some roots. So I ended up going to Columbia, which did not have a landscape program. Had I gone to, say, the GSD, I may have made that switch sooner. But I did a 3-year program, got my master's, did design structures and buildings, but I really, really was most interested in site. And it just became evident after about a year that I was probably not done. A master's of architecture would not be the end, that I still sort of had a few more steps before I figured out what it was I was going to do. So while I was at Columbia, which was like an incredible 3 years, to make a mid-career change like this, I mean, to go to school as a 30-year-old, I really felt like I was entering a monastery. I mean, it was just fantastic to be free to just think about what interested me for those 3 years and not worry too much about earning a living or the incredible deadlines that you find in the film business. So this is a study model I did for a project the project was actually very large scale. We were looking at Butte, Montana, and thinking about sort of mining, resource extraction, how we sort of dwell. And this was a very early study model, also kind of westward expansion, all kinds of things. It's about this big, and it was sort of like a parlor game. It was I made a little landscape out of paper mache and mounted it in the box, and then that's a little bead of mercury, and the idea was sort of watching where the mercury goes across the little paper topography. And then I did a series of drawings after that, which was sort of mapping where it went. But that was here I'm studying architecture, and I'm just really yearning to be doing something else. So when I was going to Columbia, I was commuting. I lived in Lower Manhattan. I was going back and forth by subway, and I had a friend, Nicholas Quinnell, he was our neighbor. He was an old friend of my husband's, and we would ride the subway back and forth together and talk about all kinds of stuff, but also talk about relationship of architecture and landscape architecture. And he's I don't know how many people have you ever had the chance to work with Nicholas or know him, but he's just a really lovely, smart, modest, and very funny man. And those little subway talks were pivotal. So when I graduated from Columbia, I went and worked for an architecture firm briefly, and Nicholas called me and said that I'm doing, we're redoing the children's zoo in Central Park, and do you want to come and design the sheep sheds and the cow barn? And I thought, yeah, all right, that sounds great. So as part of that, we had a really extensive public review process. It's Central Park, it's the Children's Zoo, and there are lots of community planning groups all around the perimeter of Central Park. And it's Central Park. I mean, it was an amazing first job. But the experience of going through the public review process and seeing all the citizens with their pitchforks being really, passionate about either saving the old zoo or not screwing up the new zoo, and just honor how much this place means to us, really left a very strong impression on me. And I thought, I really thought I can do so much more damage as an architect than and I can do so much good as a landscape architect. Yeah.
You drank the Kool-Aid.
I did, and there was really no turning back.
Nice.
So
in 2002, you moved to San Diego,
yeah.
and you describe it as arriving on Mars.
Yeah, it was.
So
It is. I mean, so this is a very circuitous path I'm making, and it was the move from. We followed my husband. My husband is a molecular biologist, and he got a position at SIO in San Diego. We had never thought about moving to California. 10 years in the film business. We were both in the film business. He was a career changer as well. Never occurred to us to move to Los Angeles. So it was science that took us to San Diego, and that was really the point where I decided I am absolutely not an architect, because there is so much to learn as a landscape architect here, because there's no soil, there's hardly any organic matter, there's no rain. It's completely different. The plants look like they came out of Dr. Seuss. It's just too different, and I got a lot to learn here.
right.
So that's actually when I got my license and everything else. I spent the first couple of years trying to figure out where to work. I was lucky enough to meet Leslie Ryan, who had been with you when you were at the Spurlock office, and she said, "Go talk to Andy. Go talk to Andy and Marty." She said, "Just you got to go do that." So I did. Talk to them.
And the rest is history.
Yeah.
You mentioned that your role, and I love how you always answer questions with sort of film references, being from the film. You said your role sometimes is like the consigliere from The Godfather with these two clowns.
Yeah, it's true.
In what way?
I gave them counsel. I really did. I mean, it's two designers. There's so much similarity between them, and there's so much that's really, that dichotomy we were talking about, the paradox, there's so much that's different. That, you know, Marty and Andy have a very, very similar background, very, very similar sort of ethos and approach to the profession, but they're two very, very different guys. And actually the other big difference, the huge difference between Marty and Andy and me, is that I came to them as a well, my crazy path, but also I was a working parent. I was a mother, and
You needed a mother.
no kids, no dogs, no house plants, nothing. I mean, there's like nothing that's going to get them out of the office. And actually, honestly, the 10 years in the film business, super deadline driven. You
Nice.
had to be done when you had to be done. It was very closure oriented. So,
So you are a
Well, and
consigliere.
Some
I
of the
am.
background is that Lee started asking, what's the future of this firm? And took on the role of being the managing principal, which kind of meant that she was going to have to mediate to a degree between the way Marty and I were working. And that had always been an issue in our office, and difficult for our employees to get a handle on, of working back and forth between us, because we hadn't really separated into two teams. So they'd work with Marty part of a day, with me part of a day, and we have a different style.
yeah, it was a little bipolar sometimes.
Okay.
So I was trying to kind of get
Keep
a
the
yoke
trains
on
running.
us and get us going in the
Keep
same
the
direction.
train rolling.
Yeah.
So it kind of leads to a question. You know, like every landscape, it's in constant change. And I think it's true for every design office as well. And you guys are facing some change right now, and that change is coming somewhat soon. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what that change is.
Yeah.
Well, just as background as well, one of the things that I have felt very strongly from the time that I started a practice is that it changes constantly. And Marty's thinking about leaving the office now, or his plan to leave is leaving. And it's something that I really appreciate, that people do need to move on. And it's one of the great things about our office is that we have had extremely emotional for me, so many people in and out of our office who have gone on to have great careers beyond our office, like Leslie Ryan. We've had two people who have gone on to win the Rome Prize after leaving our office. Dale Schaefer's here. He's been working with Thomas Balsley in New York and now doing new things. And Mark Streeter, Karen Scarborough became assistant environmental director in San Francisco. So it's part of the importance of what we're trying to do as an office is to foster change and foster growth.
Yeah.
And I think that's happening, and it's really exciting for me and emotional to be part of that change.
Yeah, it was something that I remember from working with Pete and Doug Finley early on. Was you can never worry about keeping people. You need to find the best people you can, and you need to give them as much room as you can and let them do their best work. And if they go, they go. And boy, that just really started resonating. I mean, we were 4 or 5 years into the firm and we finally had some really great people, and they were really firing. And and then they'd say, "Hey, Andy and Marty, can I talk to you today?" And I, okay. Gosh, it's really been great here. I learned so much from you guys, but I'm leaving. And
You always know.
yeah, it's like,
No question,
yeah,
you always know.
Yeah.
why did they want to talk to the both of us? That was
Yeah.
the big giveaway. But wow, you just feel so proud to see these people starting their own firms, and and then it's just so emotionally charged when they call you back 2 or 3 years into it, and it's this conversation. Well, yeah, I knew I was a good designer, but what you guys taught me about how to run the firm, how to keep records, how to do a contract. He says, man, that stuff is so. He says, I'm starting to try to set our office up, and boy, I just know how to set up the files the way you guys did. And he said, I never really appreciated that working there. And so it's that it's that part of the balance, that continuum that a firm, and our landscape architecture firm is on this continuum from, you know, the technical rigor and problem solving and making to pure inspiration. And you have to have all of that. And it's something that I think we're really proud of, is that we in San Diego have this thing that for 27 years has always been profitable. It's been a lot of fun. And I was, I can remember laughing when people would joke, I'm turning 21 and that's a big deal, and 30, I'm just afraid to be 30, and 30, none of those ever bothered me, but 60 was very reflective. I'm 62 now, and for whatever reason, I got this graphic image in my head about you're born and you die, and I'm thinking like where my hand is stopping, you know, and there's a chunk left if I can stay healthy, and that became really reflective. And knowing that my wife and I had loved San Diego, but it was just about working with Andy, and it was sort of, and I said, let's talk about something different. And it's also happening at a time when Lee has just emerged through these many years as this exceptional leader, and I think you can appreciate from hearing from her, it's not just keeping the trains running on time and that scheduling, but it's the complete exposure to the full aesthetic environment that Lee's had from the very beginning, and the environmental background of her grandparents, to put her in a position to be so critical of what decisions need to be made in a firm that's designing something, because it's always about we're designing it, and it's everything she can do to make that process give as much time to design as possible, and being so proud of where she was, and we'd elevated her, and then she'd always been honest about, well, what is the plan for you guys? What's your exit strategy? How long do we have? What's going on?
I wanted to know if I was staying on Mars, basically.
Yes.
Or was I going to get to go back to the mothership?
Yeah, so we built this very nice controlled environment for Lee to live on Mars in. And we're so happy to start discussions with her about 4 years ago about being an owner. And again, maybe get into the weeds. We have great technical advice. We were very fortunate to be invited to be on the CEO roundtable, and the camaraderie and sharing of how firms run. And the big question was, how are all the baby boomer firms transitioning their owners? And we're taking real advantage of the wisdom that's around us, and we're on a track. And so I got this I'm 60 thing going on, and I'm thinking, this is running really well. We're more profitable than ever. Andy's doing great, getting great work. The firm's getting great work. And I'm thinking, I would like to I think Laura and I should do something different. We should try to live somewhere else. And so I had the tough conversation with Andy about 6 or 7 months ago to say, I want to do something else. So we're in transition, and
we look forward to seeing that for everybody.
Okay.
So let's talk about your work
All right.
a little bit. So,
That's the Mars shot. Yeah, there we go.
So this,
So-
yeah.
well, I just
go
want
ahead.
to, I mean, it's clear that all three of you have a passion for design and for art. And it's clear in the work that you're going to talk about. And just Andy, your kind of ideas and linkages about, ideas, community, and the landscape, I think are prevalent in all scales of your projects. So with that, have at it.
Okay. One of the connection I'm going to make back to my background of liking to explore many different things is that while I was getting started in this program, interdisciplinary program, being exposed to Kevin Lynch also exposed me to San Diego, because he, slightly later than I got out of undergraduate school, worked on a project called Temporary Paradise for San Diego. So by the time I was going out there to visit, and interviewed for a job. I had seen a report that Lynch had produced called Temporary Paradise. And one of the things he said about San Diego that I thought was interesting, that got me intrigued into moving there after I got the job offer, was that it's a landscape-derived city. It's post-industrial. And that it made sense for him that he had been called in by a nonprofit or actually a wealthy individual in San Diego to do this study. And one of his observations was about the importance of the topography, which really interested me. And that goes back to my interest
Sure.
in Simon Winchester and thinking about how cities are formed. And drawing. This drawing has had a profound effect on the way I think about San Diego, all of our work, how it fits together, how it fits into the landscape, and how it helps to communicate visually with people. Because this study has had a compelling effect on the city. Partially, I think, because he drew it in this oblique format, which allowed people to visualize how important the river system, the canyons, and the topography are to the way the city was formed. And it's affected the urban form in the general plan. It's affected me and how we've designed almost every project. So we ran into a slow patch then in the 90s. And so I started doing hand drawing the topography of San Diego, and it happened that I got a nonprofit Citizens Coordinator for Century 3 to fund a study called Permanent Paradise, to look at what had happened since 1975, 20 years later, to the region. And part of what I was doing was thinking that the region was actually bigger than what Lynch looked at, that it went down into Baja to Ensenada, and it went all the way up to Camp Pendleton and to Orange County and to the mountains to the east, where Lynch's urban growth boundary had already been jumped. So I was trying to conceptualize what the urban form was now of San Diego and whether Lynch's thinking still had particular relevance, which it does. And then I got involved in starting a nonprofit called Canyonlands that looks at these connections and facilitates not only private projects and entities, but also public entities. So Vicki Estrada, who's here, I'm not sure she's here, but is one of the fellow members of Canyonlands. And we had worked on a master plan for Mission Valley, for example, which is at the bottom of this view, with Civitas. We had done a master plan for El Cajon Boulevard, which runs east and west. So I started to see how our projects start to connect together, and it's made a huge difference to the satisfaction I get out of doing landscape architecture and running a firm, to see that these things add up over time. Even though San Diego does not have a glamorous kind of landscape architectural world in terms of project budgets. The other thing that we've done throughout our history is work with artists. And I see it as directly related to the visual thinking about drawing and my interest in larger scale and communicating. And it goes right back to when I was studying literature and the picturesque, in the way that the 19th century landscape designers, writers, and artists thought about framing experience. That there was a big overlap between drama, playwriting, literature, painting, and landscape design, in thinking about time as an element, about spatial experience, and how you frame that, how you interpret it, and how you design it as a sequence. And so artists were also doing plays, and landscape designers were doing scenographic work related to time and experience. And this is working with Doho Sa, who is a Korean artist, and he was working with Time and Place about how he felt like he had just blown in from Korea into the US, had lived in this house in Rhode Island, now doing a sculpture in San Diego on top of an engineering building, and conflating the time and place nature of San Diego. But we do a lot of work at UCSD where this is, and it directly connected for me to the planning work we've done at the neighborhood level for the university, as well as the landscape architectural projects. And then at the same time, I was doing the large-scale drawings of the region for myself and for the firm. I was also working with Bob Irwin on the Getty Garden, plus another project in the same watershed. So it's kind of interesting that I was beginning to look at another kind of topography with two artist design projects as the bookends. And Bob, surprisingly to me, is picturesque. And I thought of him as a phenomenologist. He's interested in the phenomena of nature, the phenomena of the environment, the phenomena of experience. But it's all about framing, again, and is, to me, directly connected to the notion of the 19th century notion of framing and experience, and being able to draw attention to, frame the experience, frame the landscape. So he said, well, this garden is really just framing plants. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get people to look at plants. So he and I it was a great opportunity to get to look at plants with somebody who's extremely visually accomplished and doesn't know a lot about plants. And then we've been doing a fair amount of work in botanical gardens. Lee and I have been working on 4 different botanical gardens. And here again, we're working on framing. But we did a master plan for this garden first, where we're thinking about the relationship of these different spaces and then how to frame and how to orchestrate the experience of seeing the plants at the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix. In the same way, this is working on a hospital. This is the roof of the diagnostic and testing facility at Palomar Hospital. We had done a master plan for the landscape master plan for San Marcos, Cal State San Marcos, which is adjacent to the hospital. We had also done a strategic plan, Lee and I, for a conservation project for the Elfin Forest Preserve. And we were working at the same time on an urban design plan. So there are all these different scales, but we're thinking about how these things relate all the time at the scale that Lynch was, as he's able to draw it. So I use oblique drawing used oblique drawing before digital drawing in order to be able to see three-dimensionally how things fit together at big scale and small scale. Now you can do it with SketchUp, you can do it with AutoCAD topography. But this project actually connects habitat to 2 river valleys and 4 projects that we've worked on. And the green roof is all native plants, so it extends the habitat of the river valleys and relates it to the hills. And then Marty's going to talk about downtown San Diego more than I, but one of the projects that started making connections in the downtown was the ballpark. And we were called in by Larry Lucchino, who's now at the Boston Red Sox. He was asking, well, what can make it San Diego? What can make it a neighborhood ballpark? And our answer was, well, connect it to Balboa Park and the Bay, because you can use the Balboa Park. You can use that connection as part of making it part of the city. And so we started talking about the idea of putting a neighborhood park in the ballpark that's used as part of the ballpark for games, but it's open to the public. So the public can actually use the ballpark during the week. And it connects to a series of parks then that connect the Bayfront Pete Walker project to Balboa Park, to Vicky Estrada project, to Civitas project, and now we're working on Embarcadero. And these things start to add up. And that's not something that just we do, but it's something that all of us as landscape architects can get tremendous kind of energy behind or from. Now I'm going to let Marty talk.
No, you're going to let Marty talk.
Try to speed this up. So this is an aerial of downtown San Diego, and the 2 green dots are where my wife and I have lived for the 27 years we've been in San Diego, and the office was right close by for half its life, and I could walk to work if I didn't have a meeting, but this downtown we moved from Manhattan to downtown San Diego because of course we got to live in a city, and it was scary as hell in downtown San Diego. You know, there were nobody on the streets. We were real pioneers, and but it still was the city. And then just amazing, you know, time flies. And over that 27 years, we've done all these projects. The rectangles represent master planned areas. The dots are specific projects. On the waterfront is the big master plan for North Embarcadero, and we built the first phase with Civitas. Great collaboration. And a point here is that Andy and I both like to connect dots, make connections to things. But Andy, Andy is much more interested in the connection, the connectivity. I'm interested in making the dots. Andy makes great dots too. And all this really is about connecting the land and making great places for people. So like the next slide looks at, after we've been hired to do a number of projects over the years, we had this wonderful chance to design the entire parks and open space system for downtown San Diego. And this was a very important time for the office because Lee was brought in as the principal in charge, with me as the design principal. It allowed us to hire WRT, where my wife was a partner as a consultant, and what it did was, in a way, it allowed me to make visible the connections that we wanted to make as we thought through all the projects over time. So for me, it became the image that downtown San Diego, Balboa Park, the big green piece in the top and the bay in the bottom, were all one park. And it started to resonate with people that what we do as landscape architects is really about using the outdoor environment, the urban public realm, as the connective tissue and the place to make life. So these are some of our projects, is the Children's Museum Park, and you know, wow, we've been working with all these visual artists and sculptors on projects, and almost every project we work on has had an artist involved in some way or another. But this was a chance for me to introduce the poet, Quincy, laureate of California, Quincy Troop, to the project. And so the next slide will show we just started. He wrote words, and I'd never collaborated with a poet before. And I talked to him about what we were doing. He was then in New York, and so he listened to what I talked about in terms of where opportunities might be for his words to engage the kids. And I remember one day he called me and said, "I think I got it. Would you like to hear one of my haikus?" And this was the first one he said. And he says, "I'm thinking you said you're going to have like some shade things that are up in the sky, and how's this above your future?" And the hair on the back of my neck just went up. I mean, there's these sublime moments that we've had in our firm of working with these people that go to that end of the spectrum from making. They're down here on the enriching human experience line. And you know, I love the shapes we made here, but the working with artists just gets you in a better place. So this is the North Embarcadero, working with Mark Johnson at Civitas after our firm had been hired to do the overall schematic plan for that entire web I showed you on the screen. And this is the first phase of improving the San Diego waterfront. It had been sitting derelict for over 50 years. And again, working with artist Pei White, who did this remarkable shade structures. And it's about integrating and making places for people, great gardens. And the next slide is this sublime experience to work with Richard Meyer's office and Bob Irwin again. A very interesting conversation. If those of you that know about the Getty experience know that the Bob Irwin garden and the Richard Meyer enmity was pretty serious. But Michael Palladino, the design principal for Richard's Los Angeles office, called me and said, "Do you think that if we worked on this together that Bob Irwin would even consider working with me?" And I said, "Look, Bob is, if anything, the most objective and thoughtful person who would just ask him." And so he did. And so this is the U.S. Federal Courthouse in downtown San Diego. Our big effort was stitching the city back together. Bob Irwin's hedge ramp that you see there in the picture was Bob's exterior contribution. And for me, the joy is that we put a half acre of dirt in the middle of downtown and planted some trees. And this is really what it's about, the place for people, a unique San Diego experience. These are the only one of the few native trees, the California sycamores. And it just a loved environment, and it was so.
Great, beautiful work, man.
Is this me?
This
That's
is you,
you.
Lee.
Am I? There we go. This is back to the Doho So project, and I guess I've kind of been the synthesis person here. I've done, I've worked with Marty, I've worked with Andy, and the projects I'm talking about are touching on stuff that we've already talked about. So the Doho So project was one of many collaborations that we've done with the Stewart Collection at UCSD and whoever the individual artists were. And the interesting thing about Fallen Star, which is the building crashing in, was for me personally, the way it was calling back sort of elements of stuff I'd already done, including he really wanted the landscape to incorporate the plants that were in his yard in Rhode Island. And again, it's Rhode Island. So
And you were the perfect person.
I was the perfect person. So we're trying to figure out how to make that be sort of sustainable in San Diego. And then there's sort of there's the kind of Rhode Island aspect, the very, very, very theatrical aspect of it. And then, that sort of sense of longing for place was something that really kind of struck me very deeply. This is also this is the Federal Courthouse project again. And a couple of things about this. One is that Marty and I kept saying all the way through, there's got to be movable seating in the plaza here. It's critically important, and it wasn't funded as part of the project directly. But once the project was built, the local GSA office took our word and went out, I think, to Home Depot and bought 10 sets of tables and chairs and put it out there. But it really was transformative. Not our furniture selection, but it's a really great place to sit. I was on jury duty and I sat there myself. And then this is actually one of those planning projects in a city called San Marcos, which is the very northern edge of San Diego County. This is about 2 miles from the hospital roof that Andy talked about. And this project has been something I've worked on since I started at the office in 2004. It's a development project which is built on a flood control project, and I have worked hand in hand with the tiny city of San Marcos for all that time, feeling many, many times like I was talking to a brick wall. But over the course of the years, stuff that we had been advocating for very early on sort of came back as being a priority for the city, which has been enormously frustrating and gratifying, So anyway, we're now actually in construction documents for the first phase of a trail that's going to be on the top of this levee that's flood control for the San Marcos Creek. So I'm thrilled that that's actually sort of coming to fruition. We haven't really talked too much about San Diego, but it's a challenging place to work.
I actually was going to follow up with looking at your work and seeing the beautiful things that you've done and the influence that you've had on a city. And, my question really is about if you were anywhere else, would you have the same opportunities that have been sort of confronted to you? And do you think if it wasn't San Diego, that the impact that you three have created, is indelible in the city? And that is a really powerful thing.
It is.
And it's no different than when Olmsted left and rode his horse out to Chicago to do the park systems. And, it's the same kind of thing. Little different, you got to fly out rather than ride your horse. But, yeah, I mean, think of it in those terms.
Well, so that's the other Martian aspect of it, there was a slide that we don't need to go back to, but that we buzzed through quickly. When I had first arrived in San Diego, we were out with our son, like riding bikes around a reservoir, and this very famous picture of Central Park taken in the 1880s of the skating pond with the Dakota apartment building and sort of nothing else kind of hit me. And what I thought, and I think by that time, I had either met you guys or I'd started working. I'm not at Spurlock Poirier, I can't remember quite where it is. But I thought, San Diego is such a young city. It's a nascent place, and we're very fortunate to be working here at this time where you can really see what it's going to become. There aren't that many opportunities to do that. There really aren't. And so it can be, it's perilous. We don't know which way San Diego is going to go, and San Diego moves very, very slowly. When I say which way is it going to go, is it going to go the way of sort of urban sprawl and be completely car-driven? Is it going to densify? Is downtown San Diego going to sort of, gain the vitality that really needs to be a going thing? And in the 13 years I've been here, I've watched San Diego evolve and really change. In the 27 years Marty and Andy have been here, it's profound. But there's one other little thing about that slide about Central Park. And at the time I thought, how is this landscape going to change in ways that I can't imagine? And in 2004, I was thinking really about development, and now asking that same question in 2015 is completely colored by the really profound impact of the drought and climate change. So it's different. It's a different question. Same question, different answers.
I want to make a connection back to Lynch. An observation I didn't talk about that Lynch made in Temporary Paradise was that City of San Diego is a city that in the 70s had a very unusual opportunity to control its destiny because it was a very large geographic city and could have planned for the region ahead of development. And it was a post-industrial city, so communities had been developed in a different way than many other cities. The waterfront, the shoreline or the coastline was could have been protected much more than it has been, and Mission Valley hadn't developed yet. So the canyon system could have been conserved as open space. So when we looked at it in the 70s and saw that, well, Mission Valley has been trashed. A lot of the coastline has been lost. There's a negative. But now we're doing an update for the Mission Valley Community Plan, where we're looking at rethinking some of the infrastructure and development that had trashed Mission Valley. So there's still a value to that construct of the topography and the urban, the potential for the region.
Before we open it up for questions, I'd like to say thank you, very much for being open and honest about your practice, the transition. And I think San Diego's really lucky that you three were there.
Thank you.
With that, let's open it up for some questions. Yes.
So coming from the Midwest and the East Coast, how did you adjust as landscape designers to the sameness of the climate in San Diego? Because change is so embedded, seasonal change is so embedded where you all grew up and where we are right now.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that was about all of our backgrounds was to pay attention, to not be aggressive about an interpretation of a place until we knew what it was about. And so it was one of the things that started to distinguish our work right off the bat was that we did research on our projects and clients couldn't understand why we had options, why we were asking them questions. You know, we were supposed to be giving them answers. And it's a comment I'll make about being in a place, and a place that none of us grew up in, is that there's a rigorous side to what we do, and there's a discipline to it, and I think all of us were taught that, and all of us started to do that, and frankly, that it was so easy for other landscape architects in San Diego to just work on work, to do erosion control plans, to do tract housing, and we just said we're more fascinated with infill, we're more fascinated with difficult sites that had problems, and those were the ones that allowed us to practice the way we wanted to practice, and it was a place of opportunity because a lot of that kind of thinking hadn't been applied, and we usually spent twice the fee we had in time to do work because the client wanted this solved, and we would eventually get them over to hear that this was actually their problem, and they were joyfully appreciative.
Sometimes.
But they didn't understand what we needed to do. Both of us, you know, it's a tidbit. We could get by with very little income. We weren't like trying to get an extra house in the country and all that. And we worked very modestly, and I think it's something that needs to be said to all of you that work in funny little places. I mean, San Diego is still like a funny little place. It's not big time. Is that if you like what you're doing, you really work at it, and you pay attention, and you don't, and that's more important to you than other things. Wow, I mean, 27 years, we actually got a lot accomplished, but it was hard. It was difficult financially. We never lost money any year, but those early years were very modest incomes, and we really, I mean, it was just a lot of fun. So that propelled us.
Pete, do you have a question?
I think this is probably the most intelligent discussion about landscape and a city and how the landscape and the art can affect the city. So my question is, I think that I've ever.
Thank you.
So I guess the question to all of you is, because you've gone about it, not so much in a planning way, although thoughtfully broad, you tried to make those pieces, each of the ones that you built, artful and beautiful. And because landscape is so fragile, you think that element of beauty, of thoughtfulness, and something that can be seen and remembered will bring a kind of stability over time that we generally think of architecture having. Is that something you thought about? Do you think there's a possible success strategy in there for all this?
Well, Pete, I appreciate your comments very much. And I think back to a time I went on a field trip with you. We were walking, we were in Irvine at let's see, University, can't think of the name of the community right now. And you were emotionally affected by the fact that the landscape had deteriorated, that it wasn't all you had envisioned it to be. In terms of the space that we were in and the visual, or I would say whether it was clear what the intent was. But for the rest of us who didn't know all the detail of what you had in your mind when you created that space, it was there. You could see the connections, and they are still there today. Things that you did. Some of the plants may go, some may stay. Things change over time, and that's how I think of these relationships. That the bigger scale, the bigger relationships are the most important, and that's something that I feel is very very important about cities, that you want to make that connection between Balboa Park and the bay, and the exact
Right.
design of it, or whether the trees that I put in stay, is not the issue. The fact that even drawing the connection, having somebody else see it and go, wow, that's important, is very satisfying to me.
Yeah.
Even if it never gets built,
And that-
and gratifying.
That sort of the integrity of the decisions that we make that is the common thread. We do all kinds of projects at all different kinds of scales, but we just are always, Marty was talking about the research that we do that clients don't always understand, but we're just trying to make sure that we define that sort of essential thread, the most important point, the way that it sits in the context, the relationship to other work that we've done. We kind of have to do that on every project that we do, with the hope that the integrity of that thought is going to, give it longevity.
Yeah, I was saying this morning that I remember coming to Chicago as a kid and seeing the much of the open space we see today derelict, and thinking, what will they ever do with all this green space, before I had ever thought of being a landscape architect. And same thing happened to a lot of Olmsted's work, that it was Central Park was derelict at the same time. But the legacy is that the space existed and the value existed over time and transcends the temporal.
Yep.
Yeah, if anything, I was struck, if any of you happen to hear Jacob Schwartzwalker yesterday talk about his work in China and how he's, really feeling like he's got like this amazing opportunity, because there's not a lot of focus on the public realm, the outside. And I think that that's something that I've really fought for in our projects is, if you can get 5 more feet in the right of way, and what you're doing is you're embedding and creating real land that's now titled as open space, and you're making that space, because the space can be filled with something different over time. But I think it's the kind of thinking that we bring for making connections that looks at, well, if we could get a little park here, and again, maybe even if the trees die, the space is there and it's now officially a park and it's not going to go away. It's carving out and making space and thinking about it strategically as to where it is. And then I think a sidebar is, the time we put into, as Lisa, there's not soil in San Diego, but there's trees and things that do grow there, and you want to pay real attention and disciplined research as to why the tree is going to grow, and you create that environment. So you're spending a whole lot of money on things that people won't see, but that tree will then be there.
Right.
And
That actually goes back to your question about the seasonality. That said, you have to calibrate it very differently in San Diego.
Right. Well, thank you. Again, thank you for your openness
Thank you, Tom.
and your honesty and willing to share with us a really great story. So, thank you.
thank you all.